Hello, welcome to your weekly dose of essential science news from New Scientist. I'm Chelsea White, still over in London in the studio with Rowan for a few more days.
Always a pleasure, Chelsea. On the show this week, we've got a fascinating study showing how being bullied changes your brain. We're also going to hear about the 2024 State of the Climate report that assesses 35 vital signs about our planet.
Spoiler, they're not good.
They're not good. We're also hearing the latest in the attempt to resurrect the extinct Tasmanian tiger, or better known as the thylacine.
But first, we have an historic moment from SpaceX. This was the 5th test of their Starship rocket, which is the largest rocket ever built. And this time, they were attempting to return the booster back to the launchpad.
Yeah, now it's not so much the rocket launch that people want to watch, it's the landing that's the exciting thing. This is the SpaceX commentary as the booster came back.
Booster ready for shutdown.
This is absolutely insane. On the first ever attempt, we have successfully caught the Super Heavy booster back at the launch tower.
I'm sorry, even in this day and age, what we just saw, that looked like magic.
Folks, this is a day for the engineering history books.
Our space guru, Leah Crane, is here. They were very excited, weren't they? Was it a moment of history, Leah?
I do think so. I mean, it was very cool. And if you've been to a rocket launch, you know the sort of moment of euphoria.
Can't help but get carried away.
It's crazy.
But I got some goosebumps watching it from afar, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one was particularly cool because that booster, that Super Heavy booster, is enormous. It's the size of an Airbus A380. So this thing, not only are they chucking it into space, then it's coming back down, lowering itself down to the launch pad, and doing this very careful maneuvering to sort of hook itself onto the edge of the launch tower. It's pretty impressive.
It's an amazing, amazing piece of engineering skill to have got this so quickly from what seemed like a throwaway remark a few years ago. So the whole point of this is to speed the turnaround time, isn't it, of the booster, of the rocket, of this massive rocket?
Yeah, so there's basically two parts. One is that they already took this booster back to the hangar, and I think they're probably prepping it to reuse. Mm-hmm. They don't have to build a whole new one. Mm. And there's also, of course, it's a business. There's a profit motive there. It's cheaper to not build a new one. Right now, it's sort of at a prototype stage. There's still stuff to iron out. One of the guidance grids got partially melted. One of the fins was stripped of its covering. But they are really good at iteration. SpaceX has been doing this for a long time. So one imagines that will get ironed out. And maybe, in a few years, this will feel commonplace. Yeah. Which feels wild.
Yeah. To get a bit of perspective on this, I asked a spacecraft engineer, another Leah actually, Leah-Nani Alconcel at the University of Birmingham about it. And here's what she said.
As a space engineer, one of the most interesting things to me is how much of this huge, complicated vehicle SpaceX managed to test, apart from implementing the top 6 catch. So Starship separation was almost incidental compared to the booster capture, at least according to media coverage, and yet it demonstrated controlled re-entry of the vehicle for the first time. And they did opt to grab a little bit more orbital flight time and to improve the vehicle space heritage thereby. It does seem to have been deliberately detonated on its very precise landing. So for the booster capture, it is a novelty to have such complete video coverage from space through the atmosphere all the way to the ground, enabled by the Starlink satellite network. And this is just as big a deal as the success of the Falcon 9 first stage landings, and it uses some of the same principles, using the engines to slow the rocket, active orientation control on the approach, but on a much bigger scale. I think for SpaceX, the next big challenge will be for Starship to string all these steps together. Booster capture, multiple orbits of the Earth by the Starship, and controlled landing of the Starship without subsequent detonation. This is all leading them towards the really big test, which is putting crew on board and bringing them back safely. So I look forward to seeing where they go with this in the next few months and years.
Yeah, so Leah, what's holding them back now? Because the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, has been until now making SpaceX, making an investigation into every launch before they gave permission to for the next one. But they seem to have waived that now, so we could see things start speeding up.
We could. I think SpaceX's sort of way of doing things has always been to build things really fast, test them fast,
Blow
fail
them up.
those tests,
Yeah.
blow them up.
Yeah.
But you learn when you blow up your rocket. And if you have that capability of building really fast, that does help you. I mean, as we've seen, that helps you get something done faster. They have these contracts for NASA to launch rockets to the moon and Mars eventually. Technology takes time, and often longer than the timelines that SpaceX officially gives. But I do think that we might see the pace pick up a little bit.
Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves, but, as you say, it's going to be a few years. But I saw Elon Musk wearing an Occupy Mars T-shirt. He seems to always be wearing this these days. What's going to happen when they get there? I was talking to some ESA people at the weekend, and someone remarked, we're going to have a fascist dictatorship on Mars before long. And I saw Musk giving some numbers about the amount of launches they need, the amount of material he wants to put onto Mars. And when we do have this, if they massively manage to reduce the cost of launches and the massive payload that Starship has, it starts to become achievable to put that 1 million tons of equipment onto the surface of Mars. So,
yeah, I mean, it is something where at this point where it feels like it looks possible, it's starting to feel like maybe we should have started looking at regulation about these things like yesterday.
yeah. Well, that's the thing. There's no regulation. So if he did get there, they can do what they want, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's the Outer Space Treaty, but that's far from being
don't care about
enforceable.
it, right.
Right. So there is very little regulation about what would happen. And there's also the environmental concerns on Earth if you're doing that many launches.
Yeah.
So it is
Thousands
definitely
of launches.
concerning. Yeah.
Thousands of launches.
Yeah.
Well, as other Leah said, we'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah.
Many of you will have heard of the de-extinction company called Colossal, whose aim is to bring extinct animals like the woolly mammoth and the thylacine back to life. And the thylacine, just to remind you, was a carnivorous marsupial that lived in Australia until recent times. You can sort of imagine it like a dog-like animal with a pouch like a kangaroo. And now this week, Colossal has claimed that it's taken a big step by obtaining a nearly complete genome of the thylacine. Michael LePage reported on this for us. Michael, you said in your story that this is really surprising. Why did you say that?
Hi Chelsea. Well, Colossal is claiming that the thylacine genome is more than 99.9% complete with just 45 gaps that they're going to fill in soon. And there are a couple of reasons why this is so surprising. The first is it's really hard to get a complete genome of any living organism, let alone an extinct one. In fact, it's only a couple of years ago that the human genome was finally completed.
Wait, Michael, I thought the human genome, had been completely sequenced, like decades ago.
Yeah.
Well, most of it was, but there are these parts of our genome that consist of lots of short repeated sequences, and these are really hard to complete with standard techniques because these sequence short pieces at a time. So it's like being given a list of the words in a book and told to put the book back together. It's just impossible. So a whole genome sequence at the moment really means most of the genome sequencing. But in the past few years, we've developed these so-called long-read sequencing techniques, and that effectively gives you whole pages of the book. So it's so much easier to put all the pieces back together.
And presumably that's what Colossal used for the thylacine?
Yes, they did. But usually it wouldn't help with ancient DNA. So the problem is, as DNA ages, it starts to break up into lots of tiny pieces. They can be smaller than 100 base pairs long. In that case, long-read sequencing doesn't really help you put it back together. So the second thing that is surprising is that Colossal says it found really well-preserved DNA inside this 120-year-old tooth from a thylacine. And it says it was able to sequence pieces of DNA that were thousands of base pairs long.
So say Colossal have this nearly complete genome. Can they stick that into cells from some, relative of the thylacine and revive it that way?
Well, first, just a note of caution. So we've only got this press release from Colossal to go on. There's no scientific paper to back up their claim that this genome is so complete. And if you think about it, how do they know that their thylacine genome is 99.9% complete when they've only got this one genome to go on? What are they comparing it to? So I asked Colossal about that, and they said that 99.9% figure is based on comparisons with living relatives of the thylacine. So maybe it's right, but I don't think we can be completely sure yet. But to answer your question, no, we don't have the ability to sort of turn a large genome sequence back into an actual piece of DNA and get it working in a living cell. Not the kind of size we're dealing with here. It's kind of possible to do with bacteria with their tiny genomes, but even then it's still really a lot of work. So Colossal's plan is instead to genetically modify another living marsupial called the fat-tailed dunnart and to make it more like a thylacine. So basically it's going to swap key parts of the dunnart genome with those of the thylacine.
That sounds reasonable, and if you don't know what a dunnart is.
It's got a great name.
But a dunnart is a marsupial mouse. It's the size of a European or American mouse. And, a thylacine is this big dog-like carnivore.
Yeah, how's that supposed to fit?
It's like going from a mouse to a tiger by gene editing. So, isn't that just massively ambitious and impossible, Michael?
Okay, so this all comes down to definitions. Now, if you read the small print, it's always been clear that when Colossal says we bring in a thylacine back from extinction, what that really means is we're going to create an animal that's got a lot of key traits of the thylacine.
Like a dunnart with sharp teeth and stripes on its body.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, is that achievable? I mean, in the long term, if you throw enough resources at it, I think it probably is doable. In the short term, well, it's highly unlikely for all those reasons you said. I mean, it's not going to happen in the next few years, for sure. But, I mean, one of the claims here is that this is about restoring ecosystems. And to be fair, if that's your aim, you just need an animal that plays the same ecological role. It doesn't need to be exactly the same animal. But then the flip side of this is that we've changed the world way too much for a single animal to restore an ecosystem now. I mean, Australia has been completely transformed by farming and invasive species, and now it's been altered even further by climate change. I mean, that ecosystem that the thylacine used to be part of, that's gone forever now.
Yeah, this is my cue to mention an incredible book I've just read, Question 7, by the Tasmanian writer Richard Flanagan. It's shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Award this year. A sensational book, by the way. Everyone should read it. Amongst many other things in it, it talks about how Tasmania's been wrecked and exploited over the years, like you've alluded to there, Michael. And I agree. Like bringing back this pseudo thylacine is not going to fix that.
We've got an extraordinary story about childhood bullying now, and how brain scanning seems to show that it affects male and female brains differently. Alexandra Thompson is here. You've been working on this story this week. Take us through it.
So the sort of headline news of this research is that being bullied as a child or a teenager does seem to impact the developing brain, and that then produces changes to the structure that may influence susceptibility to mental health conditions in the future, like depression and anxiety. And that's according to the largest brain scanning study of its kind.
So I guess it's not surprising that bullying might show up as changes in brain activity, say in areas about fear and anxiety. But is this saying it changes the structure of the brain and has lasting effects?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a study of more than 2,000 people who were completing questionnaires and having their brain scanned via MRI at 3 different time points. So when they were 14, when they were 19, and when they were 22. And they were asked about their experiences of being bullied. And the study shows that being bullied seems to affect 49 brain regions, particularly those responsible for memory, learning, motor movements, and emotional regulation. And the researchers said that what's particularly intriguing were enlargements in the subcortical regions. So these are bits of the brain that send messages to the prefrontal cortex about what's going on in the body and the environment. And it acts as a kind of governing system, so it selects what's important and what you can ignore. So increased volume in this area might mean that the impulses going to the prefrontal cortex are stronger than in other people. And the researchers said, it might be tougher for this governing system to regulate everything, which then may make it more difficult later in life to control emotions.
And how do we feel about the data? I know that brain scans can be unreliable and patterns can be difficult to replicate.
Well, it's not been peer-reviewed yet, but actually the brain scan unreliability often relates to brain activity. Brain structure is a bit more trustworthy. So I think there's good reasons to expect that the changes here are real.
And what about the male and female differences that we talked about earlier?
So in girls, bullying was associated with increased volume in areas such as the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala compared with boys. So these areas are integral to how we process emotional and stressful responses. So the changes may be more pronounced in females because of the type of bullying they experience, which could involve more manipulation and exclusion. Whereas in boys, there were more changes in regions associated with spatial awareness and physical coordination, which may be because they tend to experience more physical bullying.
Alex, just drawing back a bit from this, do we think that the impact of bullying generally has been taken seriously enough? And maybe this study will help make people take it more seriously.
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I'm in my 30s, but my experience of school was it was not taken seriously at all. And this work really brings home the effects that bullying has and how long they can last. So one of the people we spoke to in this story said that, the fact that girls are more severely impacted in certain areas of the brain shows that we need to better understand why this is happening, because they're having difficulties with the emotional processing. And so to do that, we must listen to their experiences.
Young brains are sort of famously flexible and adaptable, aren't they? So I'm wondering if people could bounce back after a period of bullying once they've grown up and moved on.
Well, that's really the question. I mean, are these temporary changes or are they permanent? So during adolescence, even though the brain is more sort of flexible, it's also more susceptible to stress. So it reacts more acutely to hormones like cortisol, for instance, which is released in response to bullying. And it's also less resilient to the impacts of stress. And so for children, it's more challenging to suppress and replace negative emotions, which may explain why bullying can lead to changes that are linked to negative mental health conditions in adulthood. But not all changes are necessarily bad. So some people are bullied and they actually become more resilient. And it would be really interesting to find out why some people have that and some people don't. So there could be a threshold where you can handle a certain amount of stress from the bullying, and that makes you resilient. But if it tips over, then you get more negative consequences. And that could vary from person to person depending on other environmental factors and also their genetics.
Now, I want to talk about the 5th annual State of the Climate report that came out last week. This is a piece of work by a group of prominent researchers, and they've assessed 35 planetary vital signs, including the amount of heat in the oceans, the thickness of the glaciers, and these vital signs also include measures of human factors that drive many of those changes, such as meat production per capita and subsidies for fossil fuels, both bad things, I think. James Deneen reported on this for us. James, they haven't minced their words, have they, these authors?
No, they haven't. Here's how the report starts. Quote, "We are on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. This is a global emergency beyond any doubt. Much of the very fabric of life on Earth is imperiled."
Ooh, imperiled. That's pretty stark language.
Yeah, and the reason for it is that of those 35 vital signs they assessed, the report finds 25 of them have reached record levels this year, most of them breaking records that were just set last year in 2023. Greenhouse gas emissions this year have surpassed the equivalent of over 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The human population rose to 8.12 billion people earlier this year, while the ruminant livestock population, things like cows that generate a lot of methane, reached 4.22 billion animals, just to name a few. The impacts of climate change have also reached record levels. There is more heat in the oceans and seawater is more acidic, while sea level continues to rise. Record amounts of mass were lost from Greenland's ice sheet, and heat-related mortality in the U.S. has also increased. This line from the report really stood out to me. Quote, "We have now brought the planet into climatic conditions never witnessed by us or our prehistoric relatives within our genus, Homo." I think each of these vital signs they looked at is really worthy of attention on its own. But one thing that jumped out to me in this year's report was that 5 of the indicators did not set records in 2023, but did this year. So there's something new there. That includes record consumption of coal and oil. The Antarctic ice sheet lost more mass than at any point over the past 22 years we have of records. A record 11.9 million hectares of forest burned, and global average temperatures rose further above average than at any point in at least the past 145 years.
And it's also mind-blowing that while all of this is happening, denial and misinformation seems to be growing too. But does this report suggest we're doing anything right as a species?
Yeah, some of the indicators actually set records in the right direction in terms of mitigating climate change. For instance, solar and wind energy consumption reached record highs. And in the world of finance, there was a record level of divestment from fossil fuels. The proportion of global emissions covered by carbon pricing also rose to record levels this year, and the rate of deforestation in Brazil saw a decline. But the researchers argue that this is far from sufficient. They write, tragically, we are failing to avoid serious impacts, and we can now only hope to limit the extent of the damage.
I asked one of the study authors about this, Tom Crowther of ETH Zurich, and here's what he told me.
It's staggering that in a world where billions of people are already suffering from the impacts of climate change, our fossil fuel emissions and our deforestation rates are not slowing, they're actually accelerating. There are some signs of hope coming from the growth of renewables, plant-based foods, and the momentum for the biodiversity movement. But these developments need to be paired with reductions in fossil fuel consumption if we're going to have a chance of avoiding a very highly uncertain and probably catastrophic future.
I mean, all you can do is keep talking about this stuff, which is why we talk about it a lot on the podcast. As Tom mentioned there, and as you said, James, a minute ago, there is hope in what's happening with renewables. And I just saw some new data showing that China, renewable energy in China is now outpacing fossil fuels. And solar alone should pass coal as the main source of electricity in China by 2026.
That's it for this week. Thanks to all our guests and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us and give us a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And there's always more from New Scientist on our website at newscientist.com. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.